Hey kids, welcome to part 4. Yes, our final part of our final video lesson unit of the year. Of course, we're talking about Reconstruction in America, that era after the Civil War where the North and South reunited to recreate one amazing country. Last time we talked about those carpetbaggers and scallywags and how they came south to help rebuild the South into a new part of our nation. This time we're talking about the new South. What South would emerge after this period of Reconstruction? Would it be a good South, bad South, in between South? We'll find that out today. So, grab your ticket, pop some popcorn. We're gonna watch a movie of learning. Actually, we are. Oh, that's so cool. We're actually watching a movie of learning right now. One of these things finally worked.
This is not an amazing happy ending, where the North forced the South to allow African Americans to hold public office, vote, and become educated, and then suddenly racist whites in the South saw the error of their ways. I'm sure this happened with some people in the South, but unfortunately, the majority of Southerners' reaction was to fight against all the changes the North was forcing them to make. As we discussed earlier, some Southerners resorted to violence and intimidation to make sure that whites stayed in control. Over time, the resistance of the South outlasted the desire of the North to make changes in the South. Reconstruction started to lose steam at the end of Grant's first term. His presidency had been hit with several scandals, which took away some of the power of the presidency. Grant also became less willing to commit troops to help the South fight racism and enforce Reconstruction laws. Even though he faced a tough election, he was re-elected for a second term in office in 1872. After the election was over, Congress passed the Amnesty Act, which pardoned most former Confederates. This act allowed almost all Southern whites to vote and hold public office again. Because of this act, the Democratic Party began gaining traction for the first time in the South since before the war. Whites in the South who didn't join the Republican Party were threatened and harassed into doing so. Violence also continued to be used to keep African Americans from voting. This resulted in Democrats returning to power. Many of the same people who held power before the war were returned to power. By 1874, the Democrats held a majority in the House of Representatives for the first time since the war. Reconstruction would come to a formal conclusion because of the outcome of the election of 1876. Although Grant thought about running for a third term, the Republicans chose Rutherford B. Hayes to run instead. The Democrats ran Samuel Tilden. After the election, it appeared that the Democrats had won. Tilden had 250,000 more votes than Hayes, but the Electoral College was a different story. Tilden was 1 vote short of winning the presidency, while Hayes was 20 votes short. The reason why both candidates were short Electoral College votes was because the results in 4 states were disputed. This means they didn't trust the vote counts were accurate. Congress voted to create a committee of congressmen to decide who should get these disputed Electoral College votes. To make it fair, the original committee consisted of 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. However, not long after the committee was formed, the independent member quit and was replaced by a Republican. Once the Republicans had a majority of the committee, a vote was taken and the result was all 20 Electoral College votes going to the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes. The result of this election, however, came with strings attached called the Compromise of 1877, which in exchange for accepting the election of the Republican president, the South would get the following conditions met. All Northern troops would be removed from the South, and Southern states would receive more financial aid from the government. The North got Hayes as president and a promise from the South that once these conditions were met, the Southern states would maintain African American rights. The Republicans kept their end of the bargain and removed troops from the South and gave more aid to the South. The South, however, did not maintain African American rights as it agreed to in the compromise. As soon as the Union troops were removed, Democrats in almost all of the Southern states set out to systematically infringe on the rights of African Americans. The 15th Amendment of the Constitution forbid any state from denying someone voting based on their race. So, Democrats in the South found other ways to take away their voting rights. The Democrats realized that African Americans had some things in common. First, they realized that most African Americans were poor, so they required a poll tax, which meant people had to pay a tax to vote. They also realized that many former slaves still had not learned to read and write, and created a literacy test. that people had to pass in order to vote. These measures, however, were not perfect, as there were poor and illiterate whites as well. To fix this problem, they came up with the Grandfather Clause. This clause stated that if someone failed the literacy test, they could still vote if their father or grandfather voted before Reconstruction. Since no African Americans were allowed to vote before Reconstruction, this would allow illiterate whites to vote while still not allowing illiterate African Americans to vote. In addition to keeping African Americans from voting, white Southerners also passed Jim Crow, or segregation laws. These were laws that tried to keep African Americans and whites separate in public. Many Southern states passed laws to create separate restrooms, trains, as well as many other public services. These practices were challenged in court, and the Supreme Court upheld the rights of the states to have segregation in the landmark case of Plessy v. Ferguson, which ruled that separate but equal access to public services did not violate the Constitution. The problem with this practice was that although the separate part was easy to do, the equal part was not. Time after time, whites would put more money into public places for whites than for non-whites. Even though it was quickly very obvious that separate was not equal, this practice stayed in place for over 50 years. So about that New South that came about. If you recall, before the war, the South had an agricultural economy. It mainly grew cash crops, which it then traded with the North or other countries for the goods it needed. This, however, made the South dependent on others for them to prosper. Many people wanted that to change. The way to make that change was to bring industry to the South. Although the South would never be the industrial powerhouse of the North, they did add a great deal of factories, railroad lines, telegraph lines than they had before the war. The New South would compete with the North not in the battlefield, but in the marketplace. The South, however, had many problems that kept them from becoming fully self-sufficient. First of all, the climate and the soil in the South were still very good for farming. This alone would make it less likely for people to use their land for factories. The South also had a lot of poor people because of the newly freed slaves and the devastation of the war. Building the new industries and rail lines in the South would help some, but whites were constantly making it difficult for former slaves to prosper by only giving them the lowest level jobs, not giving promotions, not granting loans or housing, and much more. These combined difficulties would make it impossible for a large percentage of the Southern population to prosper. In the end, the New South was more industrialized than the Old, but still relied mostly on farming for its income. So what? Well, if you can answer the following questions, then you'll learn what you needed to know. Number 1. What events led to the end of Reconstruction? Number 2. Was the Compromise of 1877 good? Why or why not? Number 3. What was the New South and why do you think it was created? Well, there you have it. That's all for this unit, our final unit. It's been a great year. Thanks a lot, kids. Hope you learned a lot.